Good evening, I'm John Lentz, State & State's Managing Editor. For this last look, we're reviewing highlights of our On Energy conference we held earlier this week, which focused on the energy highway, renewables, and efforts to improve the reliability of the grid. And Michael, I'd like to start off with you talking about Superstorm Sandy. What have we done in those 11 months, and are we prepared for a similar storm?
And Sandy, I think, particularly in the wake of Irene the previous year, even though Irene was primarily a devastating event upstate because of precipitation, but I think the succession of those two events really raised consciousness for all of us in terms of external threats to the system that by their nature cannot be forecast or anticipated, at least with any long-range certainty, but that we know are on the horizon sooner or later. And I think there's been probably a heightened focus across the entire city, led by the mayor, in terms of saying, what are we going to do to deal with these events that may be upon us? We don't know when. The Con Edison system is famously reliable, often recognized as the most reliable system in North America, in large part because of its vast areas of underground network system. But when you have an exogenous event like a Sandy, we saw approximately 6 or 7 networks knocked out just by the fact that storm surge inundated a transmission station on East 13th Street. And traditional electric engineering planning doesn't account for that kind of an external event. I mean, typically it's ground up, feeder by feeder, and what we've suggested since Sandy is that not only do we have to recognize the new FEMA maps, the 100-year floodplain, the fact that power plants, such as those represented here by Ray, are typically on the waterfront, and you can have an event that sweeps across the city and really upends the entire electrical network. So what we've tried to do is to change the thought process, to change the paradigm, whether it's at the New York State Reliability Council or at the independent system operator, the grid operator, and working cooperatively with public service staff and with Con Edison, we've tried to suggest that we really need to have a new paradigm that will take into account all of these events that can occur. They may be rare, but they're devastating when they do occur.
And we'll return to that in a minute, but I wanted to turn to the senator and look out to Long Island. One of the key issues was the Long Island Power Authority and its performance during Sandy, and that led to some changes up in Albany this year. Could you talk about that a little bit?
This year in Albany, and I guess kind of a little bit to answer your first question, we're not quite ready, but we're on our way to being ready. To quote Governor Cuomo, we're having these 100-year storms now every 2 years. And so we now need to be prepared. And I think that it's a process, right? It's not, yesterday we weren't prepared, today we are prepared. I think that we have to be continually in the process of preparing for the next event and upgrading and improving our entire system to make sure we are reliable and safe. This year, from a legislative perspective, we really did focus, on Nassau and Suffolk, particularly in reforming Long Island Power Authority, which had some really, really devastating effects. And I'm not, I know that I don't want to throw LIPA under the bus, but we weren't prepared, not necessarily because of them, but because of exactly what Michael just talked about again. Is that this is the kind of thing that we haven't seen prior to now in consecutive years, right? And so there were things that needed to be done. So the LIPA reform is really great for 2 reasons. One, that it puts there's a lot of elements to it, and I won't kind of bore everybody with all the legislative details, but there's 2 things that are really, really important. They reorganize LIPA in a way that puts customer reliability and price first. And part of anybody here who lives out in Nassau or Suffolk will tell you quickly is that the prices out there for energy are just really, really astronomical and not something that's sustainable either for consumers or for businesses. And so, we began the process of dealing with that and addressing those issues. The second thing is that the LIPA reform put a office of the Public Service Commission out in Long Island, which there had been one a number of years ago, and that's now returning as a full service office to actually serve the needs of consumers in Nassau and Suffolk. The second thing that we did is actually a reform of the PSC. And for a number of years, for a number of administrations, the PSC frankly was being understaffed. We're now staffing back up the Public Service Commission, and that's going to have a good effect on things like rate cases, but more importantly, on making sure that consumers, again, have access to the information and advocacy that they're supposed to have, both as it relates to rates and as it relates to reliability.
And Ray, turning to you, another big ongoing energy issue, an initiative of Andrew Cuomo, is the energy highway. And I know NRG has been involved in that. Can you tell us where that's at and what that might do to improve reliability in the state of New York?
So the energy highway is a process that Governor Cuomo set up. It's being executed. There's a blueprint that has, I can't remember how many different initiatives that it has in it. But the bottom line is the commission and the governor's office is in the process of implementing several of the recommendations that are in the blueprint. And I think it's very important because when you look at energy and start to distill it down to its core, that is what people expect. Traditionally, we've expected basically three things from our energy supply. When we flip that switch, we want the lights to go on. So we want a reliable source of power. Consumers naturally want to pay as less for power as they can. They want it to be competitively priced. And then finally, we want a very green or clean source of power, and that's been particularly important here in the city. With the things that Mike and the Senator just talked about with respect to the storms, we can now add resiliency onto that. Nobody wants to be without power for 24 hours, let alone a couple of weeks or maybe even beyond that. I think the energy highway process is important given that we've had 300-year storms in the last 4 years. And if you look at those, some of the lessons that we've learned from those storms in relation to what the energy highway seeks to do is instructive. For example, we know that there are weather events beyond our control that are probably going to continue. Mike just mentioned that in his remarks. We learned during those storms that getting power from sources far away to where it's needed is difficult when those weather events hit. I think in the city, one of the quotes that I heard was almost every major transmission line failed at some point during one of those storms. And that hampers the ability for consumers to get power back. So as we look at things like the energy highway and we look at setting what the infrastructure in New York is going to look like for the future, I think it's important that we look at those things and we look at investment of those precious ratepayer dollars where they're needed most. And I'll just close by saying, and I think you're going to get to this later, that we are in the 21st century now. There are new technologies for energy that empower consumers coming out all the time. There are companies like mine that are competing to sell those products to consumers. And I'll just plant an idea that we can talk about later. So one of the distributed technologies that's coming out is a box that you can put in your home about the size of a dishwasher. Runs off natural gas. It could generate all the electricity that a home might need. It also has inputs to run if you've got a solar array on your house or nearby solar inputs, so that the brain inside it will use the most economic and cleanest power first and then turn this on. Any excess power could be sold back onto the grid. And if the price point is about where a traditional boiler for a house would cost, imagine what that would do for consumers like the folks out in the Rockaways, who, as I understand it, are still rebuilding after the storm.
Now, Jerry, I know you represent a number of energy companies as a chairman of NY Area. What do you see as the pros and cons of this energy highway initiative?
I think before the senator got to Albany and I was a member of the legislature, the two least sexy subjects were energy and prisons. Somehow we've reached this juncture now where there's a lot more dialogue about energy more than ever before, which is a credit to the mayor and a credit to the governor that we're now having a dialogue. So let's talk from 30,000 feet up before we get on the road. 80% of the system today that exists was built before 1980. That system was built to move power from community to community and from one small area to another area, but it was never meant to be a modern, technologically great grid. So the last study by the STARS group released 2 years ago says that it would cost somewhere in the vicinity of $25 billion to take the grid and harden the grid so we can be assured of, a reliable continuing source of energy. So that's one of the problems we face. 25% of your electric bill is taxes and assessments, a variety of which add up to an enormous burden on the consumer and make it that much harder for the consumer to really handle the responsibility of paying an electric bill. When you look at these factors, then you got to say, okay, what about the energy highway? Is it good or bad, and is it workable? Well, first of all, it's great that a governor takes it upon himself to advocate for having a new road to getting more energy supply. We need it. There's going to be a shortage of energy, notwithstanding anybody's prediction. So it's crucial to have an energy highway. But the energy highway cannot be built on the premise of finding 2,000 megawatts to replace Indian Point and nothing else. It's got to be a lot more than that. So, and for the energy highway to be effective, I think it does have to rely on various new sources of energy. The energy highway has to have behind it an administration that really is energetic in pushing for energy projects. If I'm sitting in Chicago and I'm sitting on billions of dollars to make an investment in New York on energy projects, the first thing I'm going to say after reading the papers is, in New York they're against hydrofracking, they're against windmills, they're against nuclear power, they're against, well, what else are they against? The Liberty Project, they want to connect a gas line out in the ocean, and 500 people show up at a hearing to oppose it when there's an existing line right under their community that dates back to the 70s. And what we have to do in New York, and it's incumbent upon the administration, is to establish a climate in New York where the energy industry wants to invest money. If I could pick out the one significant investment that's been made in the energy industry here in New York in a large amount is the $1 billion that Entergy has spent on Indian Point, to upgrade it. So yes, we've got to find a way for the energy highway to work. We've got to be more proactive on supporting energy projects. And that's where the legislature and the governor come into play, because they've got to be more playing offense as opposed to playing defense on energy projects.
Now, part of the conversation is conservation as well. And Catherine, at DEP, that's one of the city's largest energy users. How are you trying to reduce energy usage or save money and cut greenhouse gases?
I come at it from a very different perspective. I'm the consumer. So all of the policy decisions that get made, at the end of the day, I need to implement. So we really are trying to move on a variety of different fronts. One is around conservation and going through our facilities and really looking at where we can gain a kilowatt here and a kilowatt there, because every single one does count. We spend $87 million a year on power. That is a lot of money. We're consuming 12% of the city's power budget. So we are definitely focused on conservation, but we are also focused on doing upgrades and trying to bring that alternative energy into the city portfolio. So we are installing 2 megawatts of solar power at one of our facilities on Staten Island. We are about to put design documents on the street to do cogeneration at another facility. We are hoping that the Public Service Commission approves our sale of digester gas to National Grid. We are taking food waste to see if we can produce more digester gas, which is basically methane. So all of these different projects are part of our portfolio. We think that when you talk about Sandy and resiliency, if we had been able to be off the grid, in some cases we could have lasted longer. And we'd like to be off the grid in a way that's clean rather than using diesel. In addition, we are going through and looking, we obviously control an enormous amount of water that's at high elevations moving to lower elevations, and therefore has inherent power in it. So what hydro can we install? We do have several hydro facilities already. We are soon to be submitting new additional licensing to FERC for 16 megawatts at one of our reservoirs. And recently, the City Council passed a bill that required us to go and look even further, sort of at the wastewater side. How much flow are you moving through a wastewater treatment plant, and is there a turbine out there that can be used to grab a few more megawatts? So we obviously are a very large consumer, but trying to do our part in terms of ensuring the resiliency and in some ways being a guinea pig of what are you going to do on big distributed alternative power possibilities.